Well, good morning, Dr. Freeman. Thank you so much for joining me for this interview.
Oh, I'm happy to be here, Chad.
So I know it comes up backwards on my screen here, but you wrote a book called Behemoth about the history of the factory and the making of the modern world. And you wrote this in 2018. I just came across it myself a couple months ago, and I devoured it. I loved it. I thought it was such a terrific book, just going through the history of the factory essentially, but also the factory system, everything that had to be developed around that, including the labor force. Really, cities and towns as we know them today, and society itself has been largely shaped by the factory. And I'm a big fan of industrial real estate. That's what this podcast is all about. I make my living in it. I've invested in it, but I'm also not naive to the fact that there were some negative components to the factory and the factory system being developed, and there's still challenges ongoing today. So I thought we could just have a frank conversation about the history of the factory, what that's done to society as we know it today, how that's led to and shaped where we even stand right now, and then maybe some of the ways that we could even address some of the challenges that go with it at a high level. I don't think either of us can solve these complex challenges, but at least have some ideas, discussion on it. So if that's all good with you, perhaps we could just even start with the first factory. And you mentioned this in your book. It was the Derby Silk Mill. Can you take me back to when that was first started and what that factory would have looked like?
Sure. It's a little arbitrary to say what the first factory is. And it depends a little bit about how you define a factory. There certainly were large work sites that had factory-like characteristics, prior to this particular facility in Italy and other places. But I use as a starting point 1721, when two English brothers, John and Thomas Lombe, built what we would call a factory now in Derby, England. It was on the Derwent River, to spin silk fibers. And this was when silk was becoming more of a kind of a rage almost for luxury clothing. And most of it was imported, and they were trying to do what we might call import substitution, by producing it on a mass scale, and using water-powered, mechanized spinning equipment to spin the silk fibers into threads. And the thing that's kind of amazing about this place, which, by the way, burnt down in the 19th century, it's kind of rebuilt. So it's not exactly in its original form, but the building is still there. I've been there. But if you look at a picture of it, you'd go, "Oh, that's a factory." You'd recognize it from 1721. It had all the features we associate with that. Large scale production. It had about 300 people, mostly children, by the way, who worked in this place. That's a huge leap in scale. A dozen was a large manufacturing facility before this. Now you were 300. Mechanized equipment, run by a water wheel that's under the mill. In kind of integrated production system. And the building looks like what we would recognize as a factory, maybe not a 21st century factory, but a late 19th century factory. A multi-story brick building, a stone building with big windows to bring in light, narrow and long and high to facilitate the transfer of the power from the water wheel through shafts and belts to all the machinery that actually there weren't belts, it was all shafts in that period to the machinery they're building above. So it's a kind of a big bang, suddenly boom, there's this new thing under the sun that appears. And it was, recognized as such at the time. It became a kind of tourist site. People came, they wrote about it, people knew about it. It wasn't rapidly imitated. There were a lot of economic challenges to creating a factory, but people, I think, recognized right away, oh, something new is happening. Something has changed here. It's the beginning of a kind of, to put it melodramatically, a kind of new phase of human history. But I think that it really was that.
Well, and it really was a driving force behind the Industrial Revolution as a whole, because we wouldn't have seen the Industrial Revolution without the manufacturing capacities that they had, and integrating some of this the water driving energy systems, and I suppose that like that factory in 1721, it was that when the Derby one was in, so that led to Richard Arkwright, and some of the readings that I've done on the Industrial Revolution, including in your book, referenced him quite often as the guy who took that initial factory idea and made it more of a factory system. And I believe that was in the 60s. That's when he started producing his textile mills.
Yeah, there's kind of a lag. It looked like silk was going to be the next big thing, but it turned out not to be. It's expensive. It was very difficult to get raw materials. Silk producing countries had sort of export bans. So England never developed a large silk industry. What really mattered, what exploded the factory, was cotton. And cotton became a mass commodity, in the form of cotton thread and cotton fabric, and of course, cotton clothing, and all kinds of other material. And it's in the cotton industry that Richard Arkwright develops a lot of the innovations associated with the factory. And he's not the only one. There are a lot of tinkerers and inventors and merchants who are trying to increase the scale and efficiency of production of cotton, which was being produced. The spinning and the weaving was taking place at a very small scale. It was taking place in cottage industries. People would have a spinning mill, or they'd have a loom literally in their home in the countryside, and merchants, sort of proto manufacturers, were developing networks of these kind of outworkers, to try to increase the scale. But Arkwright and others want to mechanize the process, bring power that's not human power into the process, and centralize it, into large facilities. And that involved, developing the equipment for spinning, raw cotton into thread, into twine, and then later into weaving it into cloth. And it's in the spinning side that Arkwright develops both new equipment and, as you said, develops a factory system. It's actually, he starts out in another area, but eventually moves to the area near where that original silk mill was. It was only, maybe 10 miles away on the same river, the River Derwent, that he built his first really big size factory. I say big, it had like 200 workers. In Cromford was the name of the town. And then very soon he built a second factory nearby with 800 workers. And then other manufacturers started using his equipment or similar equipment in that same area. And by the 1790s, you have factories with over 1,000 workers. So that, even by like modern standards, that's a big factory.
Absolutely.
So he really elaborated the factory, and, as you say, the factory system, because a lot of pieces had to be put in place to make all this happen.
So one of the biggest pieces would be labor, because this was before cities were overly common, and I'm imagining some of these early factories didn't have 1,000 people just living within close proximity to staff these buildings. So I two things I wanted to discuss, because I think that one point you made earlier about children working in these is that's one thing that I read and was actually pretty depressing in the book, was that children, I think some as young as 6 and 7 were working 12-hour shifts on this, and I don't know if they would have been working those types of shifts on the farm if their family operated a farm, or if this was new idea where they were just put into this factory system and had to work that. But so I guess a two-part question: what was the impetus behind getting children to and women to work in these long hours in these factories, and then how did they start attracting? How did they build? And I'm assuming this is a very complex question to answer as well, but how did they start building the network of a town or a city to accommodate all these employees?
Yeah, well, let me just say something that's the framing thing for this. And it's kind of obvious, but just worth saying. They had to locate these factories where there was water power. So they had to find a place where you had sufficient drop of a sufficient volume of water to power a water wheel with enough power to operate all this equipment. And those sites were not near cities. So London was a big place already, and there were other English cities, but they didn't have the suitable water power. So they were relocating these factories, you know, you know, it's a little bit of exaggeration, but not much to say in the middle of nowhere. And I've been to Cromford. It's still today quite a rural area. There had been a mine in the area, and that was one of the reasons why Arkwright picked it, because it had water power. But he figured that the wives and the children of the miners would be a potential workforce. And with this early spinning equipment, it wasn't heavy labor. It involved a lot of attention and repetitive labor that he and other manufacturers felt women and children could do. And it didn't disrupt the pre-existing economy to pull men out of other jobs into the factory in large numbers. And frankly, also, children especially, you didn't have to pay that much. And women, you certainly could pay less than you could pay men. So it was cheap too. So there were a whole bunch of factors that led them to women and children. And as you said, when I think Americans, we're not that used to the idea of child labor. We think, 12-year-old maybe, or 14-year-old. But as you said, we're talking 6, 7, 8-year-olds, some of whom were sent by their parents into these factories. But other times they were recruited from sort of these were orphans or kids of poor families who were living in sort of poorhouses, parish facilities, and they were contracted to these factories as they were called apprentices, but they weren't the kind of apprentice where you're receiving like technical training. They were just basically compelled labor, unfree labor by children, in these factories. So as you say, it's not a pretty picture. And to attract these workers, they had to do a lot of things. One thing is they had to provide housing, because this was in rural areas, and there wasn't pre-existing housing. So Arkwright built housing in Cromford. By the way, people still live in these houses. It's like kind of 2-story houses. Some of these houses actually, because at first he only had mechanized spinning, not mechanized weaving. That came a little later. So he built these houses. They would have facilities for weavers, like kind of loft type rooms to live in, and then living quarters. And the women and children would work in the factory spinning, and the husband would be a kind of hand worker doing weaving, all in these facilities built by Arkwright. He's a bit of a paternalist, so he built a church, he built a school, and this was pretty common. So it was not easy, and this was one of the attractions of coal and steam powered factories, because once you switch to coal and steam, then you could locate anywhere, and you could locate in a place where there already is a workforce instead of having to necessarily draw it in. So by the 1810s, 1820s, increasingly in England, not in the United States, but in England, factories are switching to coal power, steam power, to run the shafts that run the equipment. And that's when you get this explosive growth of cities like Manchester. Manchester already was a city, but it grows tremendously as it attracts new workers. A lot of these are coming off of farms in England, and also to some extent in Ireland, where these are small farmers. They may not have owned land. The landowners are consolidating their operations. People are being pushed off the land, and they go to places like Manchester to work in these factories.
Yeah, that's a great overview of how far that came in a short period of time, from being dependent on steam to now having the coal fired power. And it'd be safe to say that that's essentially what produced the second industrial revolution when it came to the US, and the US took advantage of that same type of power.
Well, yes and no. In the U.S., there was a kind of a lag because in the United States, textile manufacturing, cotton spinning and then cotton weaving begins in the 1790s, basically through industrial espionage. A guy who had worked in the British mills, named Samuel Slater, came to the United States and hooked up with some merchants in Rhode Island and built what was generally considered the first factory in the United States. It was a small cotton mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Still there, by the way. It's like a little wooden building. You can go visit it. It's pretty cool, And then by the early 1800s, 1814, 15, much larger scale factories start getting built by a guy named Francis Cabot Lowell in Massachusetts, first in Waltham and then in what comes to be called Lowell, Massachusetts. And these are all water powered. And the United States through the 1850s continues, at least in the textile industry, which is the biggest industry, to use mostly water power. Then it does eventually switch to using coal and steam, but England does it much earlier because the labor challenges. It doesn't have as many good water sites as the U.S. has for a whole bunch of reasons. But you're right; it does spark a whole new kind of revolution. First of all, you need a lot of coal, so it stimulates the coal mining industry. And it's also very linked to the development of the railroad, to move all that coal to the places you need it, and then to be able to move the raw materials to these mills. Like when they had these mills, the first mills, I mean, just getting the raw cotton, there were no good roads, there were no railroads, you had to carry them on horseback, So that second phase that you're referring to, is the steam-powered, coal-driven, railroad linked phase. And of course, railroads need a lot of iron and steel, and that in turn stimulates the iron and steel industry, both in the United States and in Britain, very closely linked to the development of railroads and linked to the growth of coal mining. So it kind of all comes as a package into the next phase of industrialization and the next phase of big factories.
And then I guess with that transition as well, there was a bit of a shift away from textiles being the dominant industry to iron becoming a lot more prevalent. Was that a gradual shift, or did that almost have like a spark that fueled that run up in demand and supply?
Yeah, well, gradual, pretty quick, really, within a few decades, but not, instantly. There were both demand issues, and the big demand comes from the creation of railroads. So to make rails, you need a lot of rails, you need a lot of iron, as well as, of course, the locomotives and so forth. But there are a bunch of technical innovations that are being worked out, that facilitate the increase in scale of production. So, within a few decades, from the earliest railroads, you now have iron mills closely linked to the railroads, operating on a scale that's larger than textile. So I'd say by the mid 19th century, iron and then steel, which kind of comes in its wake, replace the textile industry as at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. And these are the places where like the biggest factories are. And some of these are really big, tens of thousands of workers, by the late 19th century in Germany, in England, in France, and in the United States. So, even by modern standards, these are gigantic factories.
Yeah, you're right, because it's not even common to see a factory of that size pop up right now, especially in North America. It's actually it's no surprise to anybody that manufacturing has actually shifted out of North America. And and you touched on this in the book as well, is that the manufacturing and the factory system almost by design chases cheap labor. So that's why when they first started those factories, they were looking for women and children, as they wanted cheap labor, and I think that's one of the driving forces on why manufacturing, to a large percentage, has shifted over to Asia, where they can take advantage of cheap labor, and that goes to one of the points that I found very profound in the book, on how you described the factory as having a life cycle. It would come into a market, and there'd be a lot of fanfare and pomp and circumstance surrounding this big factory and all the economic development and labor that it would employ. And there's a lot of just celebration for that factory. And then as it would go through its life cycle, it would then ultimately end by moving people out. The factory would just either wouldn't exist or it'd have to be repurposed for something else, and it would leave a lot of turmoil in the wake. And I think a good example as a whole would be a city like Flint, Michigan, where they had not just one factory, but they had many factories. And when they decided to change that, and maybe they didn't decide, maybe it was forced upon them, that left a lot of chaos in the turmoil. So it could be as simple as one factory where it goes through that life cycle, or it could be a whole city like Flint. Is that something that you can that you would see happening for the foreseeable future, or was that just a trend that started when we started seeing this industrial revolution take off, and in the early stages, or is that something that you continue to see right now?
Oh no, I think it's an ongoing thing, and in fact, I think those cycles are accelerating. You know, the,
Hmm.
the cycle might have been 100 years, you know, and now it may be 20 years or 10 years. You know, for a number of reasons. Yeah, first of all, you know, you build a big factory, you know, there's a huge amount of capital investment in land and equipment, you know, and you know, and there's a certain tendency to try to pay off that investment, you know, by just kind of running the thing over and over and over again. And unless you're willing to make constant new investment, pretty quickly you're no longer the most advanced and the newest, you know, and the most technically sophisticated, because there are competitors that pop up, you know. So that's certainly one challenge, you know. But then, as you mentioned, there's also the issue of labor costs, and as other areas may begin to industrialize with lower labor costs, you have competition, and as transportation costs go down, this becomes more and more of a factor. You know, as it becomes increasingly inexpensive to ship materials across a continent by railroad, or eventually across oceans, you know, by modern shipping, particularly with containerization, you know, which greatly reduces shipping costs. So now we're seeing a bit of a breakdown of that system right now during the pandemic, you know, so who knows where the future goes. But that's, I think, accelerated this kind of cyclical tendency. You know, you pointed to a great example, Flint, Michigan. That, you know, was the kind of headquarters of the GM manufacturing system. It had multiple Chevrolet and Buick and other kinds of GM-owned factories. And, you know, it was, you know, at one point the world, you know, that, I guess, along with Ford's River Rouge and outside Detroit, you know, the world center of car making, you know. But as GM itself began building newer plants, it often built them elsewhere. You know, these were older plants, and it began phasing out production, you know, and shifting elsewhere. Eventually, that included shifting some production out of the United States entirely. And Flint lost almost all of its auto jobs, and is, you know, to be honest, kind of a wreck as a result. You know, because industry factories have, as you alluded to in the beginning, you know, they have downsides. One is the polluting effects that many industrial processes have. And if you have a factory that runs, you know, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, you know, particularly in an earlier era when there were less controls over just dumping chemicals and residue and so forth, you know, you end up with polluted sites, which are very, very difficult to use.
Mhm.
Also, you know, one industry towns tend to not attract industry in other areas. You know, GM with pretty high paid jobs. You know, other manufacturers don't want to move next door to the high paid factory, you know, because workers are going to expect those same wages. So, you know, when GM shuts down, there's not a lot of alternatives they've developed over the years. You know, so that kind of one company or one industry town, deindustrialization, factory closures, it's a social disaster, you know. And so you're left with joblessness, you know, people who grow up like, I'm going to be like my granddad and my dad. I'm going to go to high school. I'm going to take the job at the plant, and I'm going to get a good life. And I think once those plants were unionized, that was true. The work was hard, but you could get a pretty good life out of that. Suddenly the factory is gone. What are you going to do? You may own a home, which may make it hard to move because that home is now pretty worthless. The property things, the land's polluted, and frankly, also outside forces don't really care. Flint's an extreme example where literally people were poisoned because the authorities on the state and local level didn't seem to think it was important to replace the lead pipes and all that kind of stuff. So it can really be a big problem, and this is repeating. Many Americans think of China as only the place where our factories move to, or where the things that used to be made here are now being made in someone else's factories. But factories are moving out of China because, especially southern China, of course, wages and land costs have gone up there, compared to what they were 20 years ago. Also, a lot of the political leadership in these areas now wants to move on to higher skilled, higher value kinds of uses of land. They're looking at more high tech kinds of things, finance. So some of these factories are now relocating to cheaper interior parts of China, and some of them are moving to cheaper countries. They're setting up satellite facilities in Vietnam or in Cambodia. A lot of Chinese factories are now beginning to move some production to Africa, where there's a large low-paid workforce. And as you begin to develop areas in Africa that have reliable electricity, that have container ports nearby, which is what you need these days, to be able to set up a global marketing factory. Chinese enterprises are looking there. So I think that cycle you're talking about is going to be with us for some time to come.
Yeah, and perhaps there's no more better form of cheap labor than robotics, which is what just made me think of how these companies are chasing cheap labor, and if they're prepared to enter brand new markets for the sole purpose of getting cheap labor, I would have to think that robotics become that much more attractive. In my market, actually, Amazon just built a 3 million square foot industrial facility. It's a 5-story industrial park, which 5-story industrial building, which has never been built in my market before. And the majority of it is actually robotics. There's very few people that are actually working in there. And I'd have to think that this is displacing a lot of traditional workers that would have been there. I know it's looking quite out into the future, but do you see the labor force almost becoming victims of their own doing, because there's markets that people are willing to work for so cheap that at some point, if companies are driven by cheap labor, they might just even try to eliminate them altogether?
Well, I think for companies, this is a practical issue. It's a pragmatic issue. There are different routes, and depending upon the situation at company and their particular processes and skill needs, they can go a bunch of different ways. So, for example, in clothing manufacturing, there's been only a very modest amount of automation because traditionally, wherever it is in the world, it's rested on low-paid female labor. And there's still a lot of that. And so companies, all the brand name products that we buy, they're subcontracting to manufacturers in places like Bangladesh, where there's still a very large pool of very low-paid workers. And mechanizing clothing manufacturing is not easy. And these companies say, why should we do that? We can hire lots of cheap labor, and if Bangladesh goes bad, we'll go someplace else. Still a lot of the world where there's a lot of cheap labor. On the other hand, there are other kinds of industrial processes which maybe need to be located in a high wage market, like you were talking about Amazon. Amazon warehouses have to be near their customers, and they have to be near where that stuff is going to ultimately be delivered. So they can't locate that Amazon warehouse in Bangladesh. So they're facing an Edmonton or a San Francisco or a Denver, labor market, and there it may well be, economically sensible for that company to spend a lot of money, because robotics is not cheap, to automate their processes. So, you're seeing companies having to decide. You see the same thing, for example, in electronics manufacturing in China, where there has been some investment in automation and robotics, but still primarily, looking towards mass low paid wages, low paid labor. That may shift, that may shift as Chinese wages continue to go up. So, I think, yeah, absolutely, there's going to be more and more automation and robotics, but I don't think we're going to see some instant or even short-term displacement. Now a lot of people disagree with me on this, and a lot of people talk about, a kind of workless future, but I'm less convinced. I think it's going to happen in some sectors and not in others. Just one other thing about your example that you brought up, which caught my attention, which is interesting. You said it's 5 stories. And that's of course also a reversal. The whole history of factory design, and I think this is true for warehouse design too, went from multi-story, like the second factory that Richard Arkwright built in Cromford, England, was 7 stories high, because he wanted to maximize the area that could utilize that water wheel under that building, right? But then in the 1920s, you increasingly saw a shift towards the 1-story factory, high roof, but 1 story. Because then you didn't have the problems of transporting people and equipment between floors. They were quick to build. As you got new building techniques, you could have large, wide open spaces, but, now I think in some places we're going the opposite direction again, in part because in urban areas, land prices are so high. To build a huge warehouse in a North American city, you have to spend a fortune on land if you can even get it. So I know in the New York area as well, Amazon or people they're leasing warehouses from are now building multi-story warehouses. And it kind of gives me a laugh, because I remember there's a great building on the west side of Manhattan that was built by the Port Authority in the 1920s, I guess, or maybe the early 30s. And they used to boast how you could drive like a tractor trailer onto an elevator and it would lift it up, to the second or third or fourth floor, and then you could unload it there. And for a long time, people thought, oh, that's like so archaic. Like, why would you do that? And now we're back to, thinking about how do you build an urban warehouse that's, 2 or 3 or 4 stories high. So, these things are never static, and it's also tough to predict the future.
Oh, isn't that the truth? It is so difficult. Who would have thought that we'd see multi-story industrial properties when you just factor in the design elements that need to go into handling that much weight of having a semi tractor trailer drive up a ramp to the second floor with all of a full truckload of cargo on it, and multiple trucks of those. The engineering and design that would have to go into that building is intense. When you're right, most people would just think that an industrial building, single story building, expansive amount of land on it, but you're right, they're popping up everywhere, these multi-story buildings. So it is fascinating how that cycle has gone from like Arkwright having a 7-story building to mostly single story, and now we're seeing multi-story again. So just
one of the fun things for me, because I kind of came out of this as a labor historian, so I knew about work processes and industrial relations and workers and unions. But there's a facet of this project that was new to me, which was architecture. And factories really stimulated a lot of architectural innovation in building techniques and building design out of necessity. To solve pragmatic problems. Manufacturers and the architects and engineers that they worked with, really had to come up with a whole bunch of innovations, that allowed them to engage in the kinds of processes they needed, and just the kind of things we're talking about, building multi-story buildings, and how you build buildings strong enough to hold, heavy vibrating equipment on upper floors, and that led into the use of pre-stressed concrete, which ultimately became such a widely used building material. And then they shifted eventually, I shouldn't say eventually, within a few decades, to the steel glass model for the factory. So once again, we're now seeing, as you pointed out, um, uh, necessity stimulating new kinds of designs for buildings, often with mechanized handling systems, kind of as part of the design conception from the very beginning.
Yeah, it's crazy to actually think about how far it's come on one hand, but on the same hand, there hasn't been many changes. To some extent, it's still four walls and a roof. That these buildings have much more modern technology and building elements to it, but it's still a place where people come and do some work, whether it's manufacturing a widget or whether it's manufacturing textiles. There's still a lot of similarities in factories all across the world, as well as the similarities to that first building in 1721.
Yeah, it's a great point that you just made, and I think that's also one reason why it's hard to realize why that those breakthroughs a couple hundred years ago were so big, because we kind of take all that for granted. But just the very idea of having hundreds or thousands of people in the same building working in a coordinated fashion, whether it's a warehouse or a factory, you know, that's a familiar idea to us. But that was like a revolutionary breakthrough, like this explosion of a new approach to organizing society. And they all show up at the same time, right? And they all leave at the same time. They all have lunch at the same time. These were unprecedented, or pretty much unprecedented. Maybe the military had a little bit of stuff like this till the 1700s, and we're still living in that age. I mean, not all of us work in factories, obviously. In North America, very few people relatively work in factories anymore. But the basic organizational arrangements that came with the factory are still very much with us, whether it might be in a warehouse or in a school or a hospital or other kinds of large-scale facilities.
Yeah, well said on that. So I guess it's fair to say that the Industrial Revolution and the factory system played a pretty pivotal role in shaping, like you said, it was a big bang in the 1700s. It was a massive revolution, but it still continued to shape society as we know it all the way up till today. And with that comes a lot of those negative impacts as well. It's on the positive side, it's certainly led to a better quality of life. We have longer life expectancies. I would say for myself personally that I feel that we've got a lot of benefit for living in today's society, which was shaped on a lot of this stuff. But it also does have the dark side to it, and I think that dark side would be the environmental component with it. And working in this industry so closely, I often ignore that negative externality of how industrialization has taken a toll on the environment as a whole. Do you see a scenario where that improves? And I know that there's a lot of initiatives in North America, like California being one. They're taking a lot of initiatives to try and clean up the industrial sector. But outside of North America, there's a lot looser regulations in a country like China or Russia, which makes up a good portion of that manufacturing side, China more specifically. How is there even a way to deal with this on a global level when there isn't cooperation or a desire by some of these other countries to even identify this as a concern?
Well, yeah, this is a huge challenge you brought up. I think from the very, very beginning, people recognized one side of the environmental story, which is pollution, and especially once you went to steam power and coal usage. And, even William Blake, the famous phrase, the dark satanic mills, this is from the beginning of the 19th century. So, but we still have those problems. But now, of course, I think we're much more aware of the incredible resource hunger of industry as it's been organized. The tremendous demand for raw materials, but also for energy. And that's potentially catastrophic for our planet.
Mhm.
how do you address that globally? Well, that's really hard. I mean, the international structures are barely there. I mean, obviously, we have things like the Paris Accords, which my country, slips into and out of and into and out of. We're setting no example for anybody. There's been a lot of thought about this. Can you put the end user? I mean, if I'm going to use an example, but you can use a lot of other examples. H&M or some the Gap or Levi Strauss. Can we demand that in effect they become the enforcers, that they require the factories, and it's often not factories they own, but they subcontract with, meet certain standards, and I would add labor standards very importantly to that, and this is an issue. I don't want to say like no one's paying attention to this. The renegotiation of NAFTA included efforts to address these kinds of issues, but but on a global scale, we really are at a very early stage, and the clock's ticking, and ticking fast, And I think it is an open question: can we continue to live the lifestyle, the enormously resource hungry and polluting lifestyle that people in places like Canada and the United States are used to living, without destroying things. So yeah, there are a lot of efforts, and obviously turning to renewable energy and trying to work for cleaner processes. A lot's going on in that area, but is it going on at a pace that's going to deal with the problems? I don't think so, to be honest. And I also, I guess, because of my own background looking at labor, that's something I think about a lot too. I mean, look, I benefit. I wear clothing made in Malaysia and Cambodia and China, and use products made, and a lot of those products, the working conditions are very exploitative. I mean, and so I think these are big challenges. They're not new issues, but particularly the climate change clock, I think has added a new urgency. So I think it's all of a package. We can't say, oh yeah, this has all just been a great thing, because yes, it has been. It's increased the standard of living for people across time and space, but as you said, with the price too.
Yeah, and it's fine to look at things through the single snapshot in time where we are right now, and we're not having hugely catastrophic weather events. I shouldn't say that, because obviously there still are, but it's not to the point where it's disrupting everyday life for the average person in North America. There might be small events that pop up, or short events, I should say, that pop up from time to time. But for the most part, we can live the majority of our time right now without these events. But if you extrapolate that out and look for like the next generation, like what my children will be facing on the same trajectory in 30 years, it doesn't look like a very pretty picture without some major change needed in that. And I've always thought that culture and habits are one of the hardest things to change. And in North America, we just have this culture of the ability to buy essentially whatever you want, and you could even have it shipped to your house in 2 hours now, which is a crazy phenomenon in itself. But we're a culture of consumerism, and I think that consumerism mindset will have to change before we kind of have to change the demand before you change the supply, or have an impact on the supply kind of issue, because right now is with this insatiable amount of demand to just buy things, the supply will find a way to get to us, whether it's from China or Malaysia or Indonesia or Philippines. They'll find a way to get products to fill that amount of demand. So you're right. I think that it is just an incredibly complex scenario that doesn't have an easy answer, and I agree with you. I think that it's going to be very difficult to actually change on that, but I guess it'll just be an interesting thing going forward, and I don't think the Industrial Revolution story has been fully told yet. I still think that there's a few more chapters in this.
Absolutely, and I think we have no excuses. We're aware of the issues in front of us, and whether it's individual behavioral change or national regulation or international regulation, or I think all of those things at once, we can try to take this industrial revolution we've inherited and kind of transform it to at least reduce some of the harm, as we enjoy the benefits.
Yep. One thing I just wanted to end on. So you mentioned a little bit earlier that you came at this project and wrote this book from a labor standpoint, but you also just got exposed to a lot of industrial real estate along the way, and you've toured some factories. I've got that on my list. I'd love to see some of these older buildings as well. Anything else that you came across when you went through this project and writing this book that maybe surprised you?
Well, I guess how quickly people kind of were awed by all of this. I think we've become a little bit jaded. I mean, people are still interested in how things are made, and cable TV channels have shows, how to make this or that. But mostly I think people now, they just get this stuff. They buy the phone, they get the thing, they buy the car. But I was kind of amazed how deeply intrigued people were, with how things were made and where these things come from and what were these, and this was considered really at the forefront of kind of human innovation, ingenuity, and we still have some of that, particularly around computer stuff and so forth. But I guess that was one of the things that struck me. And in a way, I thought, one of the things I hoped to do with the book was just to reconnect us with that sense of, these things don't just show up somehow or another, but to take a little bit of the veil off of how the world we live in is made, and to look, as you and I have been talking about, the enormous human achievements behind those processes, but also the costs that come with it.
Yeah, well said. Do you have any other books in the works, or any projects that you have coming up?
Oh, I'm puttering around on this and that. I've gotten quite interested as an offshoot of this book on worker housing, because a lot of these early factories did build housing, and both in England and the United States, but also later on the Soviet Union and other parts of the world. So I've been doing a little bit of exploring of a history of efforts to provide affordable housing for workers, whether it's under private auspices or government auspices. And in the case of the United States, it's a story of failures as much as successes, because we still have a huge housing affordability problem. So I'm not sure where this is going, but that's what I've been thinking about lately.
Well, if you get another book on that topic, I would be the first one to buy it, because I loved Behemoth. That's why I read that very quickly, and that's why I had to reach out to you and I had to persuade you a bit to do this. But I'm very grateful that you did agree to do it. I love the book, highly recommend it, and I'd be the first one to buy any book you put forward next.
Thank you, Chad. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Freeman.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.